Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Mega Man Cave. Have you ever thought to yourself, what is the hardest game I've ever played? Many of us may default to something like Dark Souls, Ninja Gaiden, Super Meat Boy, something of that nature, but have you ever thought of Mushihime-sama Futari Black Label? Or how about Doronpachi Saidajou? Ever heard of these? Well, that's probably because they're a super cool niche gamers like myself would call a shmup or shoot 'em up. A game genre where the screen is filled with an incalculable amount of bullets that punish you continuously. The only way to survive is to maneuver the billions of enemy attacks thrown your way with pixel perfect accuracy. Oh, and did I mention that you'll die? I mean, you're going to die a lot. Lots of deaths. Lots of dying. Nothing better than getting constantly hit by stuff, am I right? Shmups or bullet hell shooters have made a name for themselves to hardcore gamers across the world, though it may be difficult at first glance to really label a game a shoot 'em up. Though there's no official criteria necessarily delineated out there, many shmup experts categorize the genre as an ability to control a character or object in the air that fires at hordes of enemies while deftly maneuvering through a plethora of colorful cannon fodder. There is constant debate on the difference between ships just shooting a bunch of stuff and characters running around on the ground shooting at a bunch of stuff. I know, we gotta get it on this level. Games such as Contra, Metal Slug, or most recently Cuphead would be considered run-and-gun shooters, while the character is fixed to the ground, and for the purpose of this video I will stick to the stereotypical ship shmups to avoid confusion. That being said, although the term shmup may come across as hip or new, the genre existed for quite some time before it knew its true identity. The first actual shoot 'em up could be argued to have existed as far back as Space War in 1962. The game features two spaceships, the Needle and the Wedge, and they're engaged in a dogfight while maneuvering in the gravity well of a star. Both ships are controlled by human players. Each ship has limited fuel for maneuvering and a limited number of torpedoes, and the ships follow Newtonian physics, remaining in motion even when the player is not accelerating. I'm sure you guys remember those old Windows 95 games that you used to play. Though only consisting of a single screen and being quite simplistic in nature, the game is technically a shmup. You control one ship shooting at another, and people went bonkers for this stuff back in the day. Space War set the stage for the oftenly open for debate first released video game of all time, Computer Space, also technically a shmup. As time went on, there came to be some different types of shmups around the world. According to whatitmeans.com, a scrolling shooter is, as the name suggests, a shoot 'em up that takes place against a scrolling background. Scrolling shooters can be divided into two categories: games in which scrolling follows the player's movement, directional scrollers, games in which the player follows scrolling, linear scrollers. That being said, Space Invaders, technically a shmup. Galaga, a shmup. Defender, oh you bet your panties that's a shmup too. See, many titles in the early days of Atari and Television used this same mechanic in some way, shape, or form to create a simplistic yet fun experience for all. In the early days, shmups were extremely common as standalone arcade cabinets. Games like Gradius were addicting enough to cause pock-faced teens to dump loads of quarters into them, while not being complex enough to break the bank in the development phase. It was a win-win for game developers. While contentious, it's widely believed that the first published instance of the word shmup was used in Commodore 64 magazine. Issue 3, July 1985. The word was initially mentioned in the editorial section written by Chris Anderson. Mr. Anderson. The shmups of the 80s pioneered the genre, and it wasn't long before future installments began enhancing the formula just a bit. Gradius and R-Type both featured the horizontal scroller view, one that I still prefer to this day, which gave the player almost a sense of progress as they traversed through the perilous skies of the shmup world. Those bullets were moving incredibly fast, and they were really hard to avoid. These games also began to introduce a power-up system that became immensely popular over the years in series like Raiden. R-Type specifically introduced bombs or special attacks as a sort of power-up that is still quite prevalent in modern Japanese shooters due to the sheer volume of crap flying at you from all angles. You almost have to use them. Shmups of the 70s and 80s seemed to be geared around high scores, a game goal that was omnipotent with any video game out in those days. Hey bro, did you see that new high score on the Galaga cab? In these days, it wasn't just enough to get through all the stages of bullet hell madness, it was honestly the score that mattered most, a trait that defines shmups new and old. These days, gamers tend to get more fixated on aspects like speedrunning. Like, what do you do with a game you've beaten a dozen or so times that has no score tracking mechanism? Well, you obviously play it as fast as possible. With the auto-scrolling limitation of most shmups, the speedrunning potential is out of the question, so most gamers are left with getting the highest score possible while avoiding death. In fact, many of the difficult modern shmups boast only a few players who have quote-unquote 1cc'd them, that is, beating the entire game without using a continue. With added scoring techniques and strategies in the future, it only made the high scores more exciting and worthwhile to obtain, making it the popular route to explore in the early days. The 90s saw a significant cutback of arcades across the world, but personal PC and video game console sales were on the rise. The shmup classics of the 80s and 90s were being ported over to home consoles for a wider audience to enjoy. Classic shmup developer Treasure was out in full force, eventually producing games like Radiant Silvergun, a game that took the shoot-'em-up genre a step further, allowing the players to target specific portions of a boss's shields or weapons, adding an entirely new dynamic and strategy to the relatively well-defined genre. One of Treasure's other main titles in the 90s, Ikaruga, took the ingenuity up to 11 with the representation of an alternate skin swap, where in order to avoid taking damage, the ship had to be facing the proper direction to absorb bullets, and if you weren't, you were getting blasted. It's an extremely tedious mechanic to perfect, but one that made the game so much more difficult and rewarding when you completed each section. Both of these games were immensely popular at release and helped lay some groundwork for many future shmups with their unique design, awesome soundtracks, and brutal difficulty. Shmup revolutionary Cave came into the picture in 1997 with their release of Dodonpachi, a completely different take on the popular shoot-'em-up genre. This was arguably the birth of the manic shooter, or shmup where there are an incomprehensible amount of bullets all slowly moving across the screen, pestering the player to no end. What followed was a generation of increasingly difficult Japanese shooters plaguing the player with the bosses that refused to die and pelt you with countless attacks. One of the only problems was the sheer price that somebody had to pay to import one of these shmups if you lived in the West. In fact, this is one of the biggest gripes from shmup fans around the world. Unless you're living in Japan, it could be quite cumbersome on your wallet to afford such a beauty of a game. Luckily, in the 7th generation of consoles, many of these Japanese titles were region-free, especially on the 360, meaning you could play the actual Japanese games on Western hardware. Except for the fact that you had to navigate through some menus through sheer trial and error. Although some games were still super expensive, this at least avoided region lock. If only I could add that to my baby registry. The shmups of the 2000s really began to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. Largely driven from Japan, these manic games introduced more involved scoring systems than we'd ever seen before. Chaining, a technique that had been previously introduced, awarded more and more points for the quick succession kills by the player, breaking the chain if you went too long between kills. Collection scoring is exactly what it sounds like. Kill the enemy and retrieve what it dropped, in the form of points. Proximity, or what I like to call crazy scoring, awards the player more points the closer they are to the mind-numbing amount of bullets on the screen. These advanced scoring systems and unique audience of players caused shmups to move away from classic time wasters to fully involved niche titles, equipped with their own cult following. Heck, I remember a period in those days where no matter what Cave released, I was all over that. If it was available in the US, I'd buy it. If it was importable, I would import it. I'd even go as far as to say I may have had a Japanese 360 back in the day. You never played a shmup the same way twice, and it was as addicting as it was frustrating. If you didn't want to get too wrapped around the point side of things, you could give it a no death run spin, and I had my fair share of fun with this back in the day, with titles like Death Smiles. I even successfully achieved some of the coveted 1cc runs, as is evident in this video. Most of the modern day shmups are fast paced, with an anime art style and upbeat techno music accompanying the background. Though most of these games are relatively eccentric, there are definitely some examples where I have almost no idea what the heck is going on. One example of this is what we call a shoot-'em-up. Yeah, I know, it sounds stupid. Harmful Park, a Japanese PS1 exclusive, is a game where you fly around in a jetpack throwing pie bombs at stuff in an amusement park that's trying to kill you. Seems perfectly normal to me. Or take another confusing as heck shmup, Parodius. Where else can you shoot the living daylights at an enormous goddess summoning cherubs at you, or bust in on an octopus washing its hair? Or skin? Okay, I'm not really sure what it's doing. I mean, come on. Who wouldn't feel socially acceptable bringing a copy of Mushi Mushi Pork and Pink Sweets to the next sleepover? Come on guys, it's the game of the century! And let's not forget about Hong Kong 97. That's technically a shmup too. Some shmups are incredibly ridiculous, so much so it only adds to the manic playthrough. That's probably why I love them so much. With one of these games, you know the basic mechanics are going to be quite similar to other titles, but the art style, characters, enemies, and weapons are essentially a grab bag. It's one of those types of genres I could just pick up at any point and just play. Overall, shmup's popularity has undoubtedly dwindled over the years. Although the US release of games like Death Smiles and Otomedius Excellent helped Western gamers get introduced to the more eccentric styles of the genre, other digital titles such as Sign Mora have really enhanced the traditional feel of a Gradius or Raiden style. Unfortunately, Cave shut its doors to the West in 2014 after releasing their final US venture, Akai Katana. The game sold poorly, and it was overproduced for the market that really wanted it. Now, in the 8th generation of consoles, we're left with mostly reboots and one-off titles. In an ever-changing world of gaming, most gamers want a more immersive experience that most shmups simply cannot provide. The story, if there even is one, is mostly bare bones, considering these games are over-reliant on replayability in short arcade sessions. For now, most of the market resides within the confines of Japan, where the localized niche can flourish both out in arcades and at home on personal consoles. But there's still tons of shmups being released out there. What types of shmups are your favorites? What other genres would you like to see me cover? Please leave that down in the comments section below. If you've made it this far in the video, I thank you, and please consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and clicking the little bell so my videos jump to the top of your list. As always guys, this is the Mega Man Cave signing out. Happy spelunking.